Have you ever been blamed for destroying someone's marriage when you were actually trying to save it? Keep watching, because what I discovered about my son-in-law will make you sick to your stomach and question everything you believe about family. Loyalty. My name is Henry Thompson, but everyone calls me Hank. I'm 69 years old, and for the past 3 years I've been living with the guilt that I somehow caused my daughter's marriage to fall apart. My son-in-law Carlos convinced everyone, including my own daughter, that my interference and meddling were the reasons their relationship was struggling. I was wrong to believe him. For 3 years, I thought I was the problem in Sarah's marriage. For 3 years, I watched my daughter become depressed, anxious, and distant, while Carlos painted me as the overprotective father who couldn't let go. For 3 years, I was the perfect scapegoat for a cheating husband who needed someone to blame for his wife's unhappiness. But what I discovered 6 months ago changed everything. It revealed that Carlos Martinez wasn't just an unfaithful husband. He was a master manipulator who had been using me as a shield to hide his affairs while systematically destroying my relationship with my daughter. If you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. What this man did to my family was more calculated and cruel than anything I could have imagined. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how perfectly Carlos executed his plan before I tell you how I exposed him. Sarah is my only child. Her mother Betty and I raised her to be independent, strong, and capable of making her own decisions. When Betty died of breast cancer 5 years ago, Sarah was my anchor during the darkest period of my life. Sarah met Carlos 8 years ago when she was working as a nurse at Phoenix General Hospital. He was charming, successful, and seemed to genuinely adore my daughter. When they got engaged after dating for 2 years, I was happy for Sarah's happiness. "He treats me like a queen, Dad," Sarah told me when she showed me her engagement ring. "He's everything I ever wanted in a husband." Carlos was everything Sarah wanted, and he seemed to respect me as her father. He would ask my advice about wedding, planning, home buying, and even career decisions. He called me Hank like we were old friends, and he made an effort to include me in their lives. "I'm not just marrying Sarah," Carlos told me the night before their wedding. "I'm gaining a father. I hope you know how much that means to me." I believed him completely. The first few years of their marriage seemed perfect. Sarah was happy, Carlos was attentive, and when they had Emma 6 years ago, I became the proudest grandfather in Arizona. But you haven't heard the real story yet. What I'm about to tell you will show you how a manipulative man can destroy a family while making himself look like the victim. The problem started when Emma was about 2 years old. Sarah began seeming tired, stressed, and emotionally distant. When I asked her if everything was okay, she would give vague answers about work stress and the challenges of new parenthood. Carlos, however, was very specific about what he thought was wrong. "Hank, can I talk to you man to man?" Carlos said during one of my visits to their house. "I'm worried about Sarah, and I think you might be able to help." "What's going on?" "I think Sarah is having trouble adjusting to being a wife and mother, while still feeling like she needs to take care of you. She's trying to balance too many responsibilities." Carlos explained that Sarah felt guilty about not spending enough time with me after Betty's death, and that this guilt was creating stress in their marriage. "She wants to be a good daughter, but she also needs to focus on being a good wife and mother," Carlos said. "I think if you could encourage her to prioritize her nuclear family, it might help her anxiety." At the time, this seemed like a reasonable observation. Sarah had always been a caregiver, and I could see how she might feel, torn between taking care of me and taking care of her own family. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Maybe just give her a little more space. Let her know that you're okay on your own and that she doesn't need to worry about you so much." I followed Carlos's advice. I called Sarah less frequently, declined some invitations to family dinners, and tried to be more independent to reduce the pressure on her. But instead of helping, my withdrawal seemed to make Sarah more anxious and distant. Have you ever tried to solve a problem by doing exactly what someone suggested, only to discover that their advice was making everything worse? Keep watching to see how this pattern continued for years. When my reduced contact with Sarah didn't improve her mood, Carlos had another explanation. "I think the problem might be deeper than we thought," he told me during a private conversation at Emma's 3rd birthday party. Sarah seems to have some unresolved issues about losing her mother, and I think seeing you reminds her of that loss. She's never said anything like that to me. She wouldn't. Sarah doesn't like to burden people with her emotions. But I live with her, Hank. I see how she gets after visits with you. She becomes sad and withdrawn. Carlos suggested that perhaps I should limit my visits to special occasions and holidays, giving Sarah emotional space to process her grief without constant reminders of her mother's absence. It's not that she doesn't love you, Carlos assured me. She just needs time to heal. Again, I followed his advice. I reduced my visits, stopped dropping by unannounced, and tried to give Sarah the space that Carlos said she needed. But Sarah's depression seemed to worsen, not improve. When I asked Carlos about this, he had ready explanations. Sarah is dealing with postpartum depression, he said. Her doctor thinks it's a delayed reaction that sometimes happens when women try to be too strong for too long. Is there anything I can do to help? Actually, the doctor thinks family stress might be contributing to her condition. Sarah mentioned that she feels pressure to include you in everything, and that's creating anxiety about balancing everyone's expectations. Carlos painted a picture of my daughter as someone who was overwhelmed by trying to make everyone happy, and who would benefit from having fewer people to worry about. The best thing you can do for Sarah right now is let her focus on her immediate family, Carlos concluded. Once she's feeling better, I'm sure she'll want to spend more time with you. If you're a parent watching this, you're probably thinking you would never fall for such manipulation. But when someone presents these ideas gradually, reasonably, and with apparent concern for your child's well-being, it's easy to believe them. Over the next 2 years, Carlos systematically reduced my contact with Sarah and Emma. Every attempt I made to be more involved in their lives was reframed as pressure, interference, or evidence that I wasn't respecting Sarah's need for independence. When I offered to babysit Emma so Sarah and Carlos could have date nights, Carlos said it made Sarah feel guilty because she should be able to handle childcare without help. When I invited them for holiday dinners, Carlos said the preparation stress was too much for Sarah in her fragile emotional state. When I suggested family vacations or outings, Carlos said Sarah felt obligated to include me, even when she wanted private family time. Every gesture of love and support I offered was twisted into evidence that I was being demanding, needy, or boundary-crossing. Put yourself in my shoes for a moment. When your child's spouse tells you that your presence is causing your child distress, what do? Do you ignore their concerns and risk making things worse? Most loving parents would do exactly what I did. Step back and trust that the person who lives with their child knows what's best. But what I didn't know was that Carlos was lying about everything. Sarah wasn't overwhelmed by my presence, she was heartbroken by my absence. Sarah wasn't stressed by my offers to help. She was confused about why I had suddenly become distant. Sarah wasn't dealing with postpartum depression. She was dealing with the isolation and emotional abuse of a husband who was systematically separating her from her support system. And the reason Carlos wanted me out of the picture wasn't to help Sarah heal. It was to hide the fact that he was having affairs. The truth began to emerge 6 months ago in the most unexpected way possible. I was at the grocery store when I ran into Maria Rodriguez, a woman who worked at the same marketing firm as Carlos. I had met her once at a company party that Sarah and I had attended together 2 years earlier. "Hi, Mr. Thompson," Maria said when she saw me. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, thank you. How's work going?" "Oh, you know how it is. Carlos keeps us all busy with his big projects." We chatted for a few minutes about work and weather, and then Maria said something that made my blood run cold. I have to say, Carlos is lucky to have such an understanding wife. Not many women would be okay with their husband working late as often as he does. Working late? Yeah, he's at the office until 8 or 9 p.m. almost every night. Maria looked concerned. Sarah's okay with that arrangement, right? I know some wives get upset when their husbands are away from home so much. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Carlos had been telling me for 3 years that Sarah needed space from family obligations, so she could focus on her marriage and spend quality time with him. But according to his co-worker, Carlos wasn't spending quality time with Sarah at all. He was working late almost every night, leaving my daughter alone with Emma, while telling me that my presence would interfere with their family bonding. Actually, I said carefully, I think Sarah has mentioned that Carlos works late sometimes. But every night seems excessive. Oh, it's definitely every night, Maria confirmed. Sometimes he doesn't leave until 10 or 11 p.m. I've teased him about being married to his job instead of his wife. She laughed, but I didn't find anything funny about what she'd just told me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I called Sarah directly instead of texting first to ask if it was a good time to talk. Dad. Sarah sounded surprised but happy to hear from me. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, honey. I just wanted to hear your voice. How are you and Emma doing? We're okay. Carlos is working late again tonight, so it's just me and Emma having dinner. Working late again? Does that happen often? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Pretty much every night, Dad. His job has gotten really demanding lately. That must be hard on you handling everything at home by yourself. It is, Sarah admitted, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. Sometimes I feel like a single parent, but Carlos says this is just a busy period at work, and that things will settle down eventually. As I listened to my daughter describe her lonely evenings and the burden of solo parenting, I realized that everything Carlos had told me about Sarah needing space from family was a lie. My daughter wasn't overwhelmed by having too many people in her life. She was overwhelmed by having too few people supporting her. But this was just the beginning of what I would discover about Carlos Martinez. The working late story was covering up something far worse than just neglecting his family. As I sat in my kitchen that night, thinking about my conversation with Sarah and my encounter with Maria, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what Carlos was really doing during all those late nights at the office, and what I discovered would prove that my son-in-law wasn't just a neglectful husband, he was a cheating liar who had been using me as a scapegoat to explain his wife's unhappiness while he destroyed their marriage with his affairs. The next evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to follow my son-in-law and find out what he was really doing during all those late nights away from home. At 69 years old, I felt ridiculous, playing detective on my own family. But if Carlos was lying about working late, and if my withdrawal from Sarah's life hadn't actually helped her marriage, then I needed to understand what was really happening. Have you ever had to investigate someone you're supposed to trust? Have you ever had to become a spy in your own family? Keep watching, because what I discovered was far worse than I ever imagined. I drove to Carlos's office building around 5:30 p.m. and parked across the street where I could see the employee parking garage. Carlos drove a distinctive red Camaro that would be easy to spot. At 6:15 p.m., I saw Carlos exit the building and get into his car. Instead of driving toward home, he headed in the opposite direction, toward the upscale part of town where the expensive restaurants and hotels were located. Followed him, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice my old pickup truck. Carlos drove to Romano's, an expensive Italian restaurant that I knew he had never taken Sarah to, because they couldn't afford it on their budget. But Carlos wasn't eating alone. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see him sitting at an intimate corner table with a woman I didn't recognize. She was younger than Sarah, with long dark hair and expensive clothes. They were holding hands across the table and talking like lovers, not colleagues. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 2 hours, watching my son-in-law have a romantic dinner with another woman while his wife believed he was working late to provide for their family. When Carlos and the woman left the restaurant together, they walked to her car, a white BMW, and shared a long, passionate kiss before getting into separate vehicles. Put yourself in my position for a moment. You've just discovered that your daughter's husband is cheating on her, and you're the one who's been blamed for their marriage problems. How would you feel? What would you do? I followed Carlos for 3 more nights that week. Each night, he left work at his normal time and met the same woman at different locations: a wine bar on Tuesday, a hotel lounge on Wednesday, an upscale apartment complex on Thursday, where they disappeared inside together for 3 hours. Son-in-law wasn't working late. He was having a full-blown affair. But this wasn't just infidelity. This was systematic deception designed to use me as a cover story for his betrayal of my daughter. For 3 years, Carlos had convinced Sarah that her depression and anxiety were caused by my interference in their marriage. He had manipulated me into withdrawing from my daughter's life by claiming that my presence was stressing her out and preventing her from focusing on her family. In reality, Sarah was depressed because her husband was cheating on her and leaving her alone every night to raise their daughter while he carried on with another woman. Carlos had turned me into the perfect scapegoat. Every time Sarah felt sad, lonely, or suspicious about his behavior, Carlos could point to my meddling as the real source of her unhappiness. But you haven't heard the most sickening part yet. What I discovered next would show me just how calculated and cruel Carlos's manipulation had been. The following Friday, I decided to do something I hadn't done in 2 years. I showed up at Sarah's house unannounced. "Dad." Sarah opened the door with genuine surprise and joy. "What are you doing here?" I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see my favorite daughter and granddaughter. Sarah's face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in years. "Come in. Emma will be so excited to see you." As I stepped into their house, I immediately noticed how run down everything looked. The furniture was worn, the walls needed painting, and there were signs of financial stress everywhere. Generic brand groceries, outdated electronics, Emma's toys that were obviously second-hand. This was not the home of a man who was working overtime to provide better for his family. This was the home of a man who was spending his money on expensive restaurants and hotels with his mistress. "Grandpa Hank." Emma ran into my arms with the enthusiasm that only a 6-year-old can manage. "I missed you so much. Why don't you come see us anymore?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My granddaughter had noticed my absence and didn't understand why I had stopped visiting regularly. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly. "Grandpa has been very busy, but I'm here now." As we sat in their living room, I watched Sarah interact with Emma and saw how exhausted my daughter looked. She had dark circles under her eyes, she'd lost weight, and there was a sadness in her demeanor that reminded me of how she'd looked after her mother died. "How are things going, honey?" I asked, when Emma went to get her art projects to show me. "Oh, you know," Sarah said with a forced smile. "Carlos has been working so hard lately. I barely see him except on weekends, and even then he's often too tired to do much." "That must be lonely for you." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "It is. Sometimes I feel like I'm raising Emma by myself, but Carlos says this is just temporary, that he's working toward a promotion that will make everything better." I wanted to tell Sarah the truth right then, but I knew I needed more evidence before I could destroy her world with accusations of infidelity. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Has Carlos ever suggested that maybe I was interfering too much in your marriage?" Sarah looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've been staying away more because I thought maybe you needed space to focus on your family without feeling obligated to include me in everything." Sarah stared at me with confusion and hurt in her eyes. "Dad, is that why you stopped coming around so much? Is that why you hardly call anymore? I thought Carlos mentioned that you might be feeling stressed about balancing time with me and time with your family." Sarah's expression changed from confusion to anger. "Carlos told you that? When?" "A couple of years ago. He said you were dealing with depression and that seeing me reminded you of losing your mother. He thought it would be better if I gave you some space." Sarah stood up abruptly and began pacing around the room. "Dad, I have never said anything like that to Carlos. I have been heartbroken that you stopped spending time with us. I thought you were disappointed in me, or that you didn't approve of how I was handling motherhood." "Disappointed in you? Sarah, you're the best mother I've ever seen. You're exactly the kind of parent your mother and I hoped you'd be." Sarah started crying then, and I realized how much damage Carlos's lies had done to our relationship. "Dad, I've been so lonely. Carlos is never home, and when you stopped visiting regularly, I felt like I was losing everyone I loved. I've been going to therapy because I thought there was something wrong with me." As my daughter cried in my arms, I felt a rage building inside me. that I hadn't experienced since Betty's death. Carlos hadn't just cheated on my daughter. He had deliberately destroyed her relationship with me to isolate her and cover his own betrayals. But this was just the beginning of what I would learn about Carlos's systematic abuse of my family. What I discovered over the next few weeks would show me that his manipulation went far deeper than I had realized. That evening, after leaving Sarah's house, I called Maria Rodriguez. I told her I was concerned about Carlos's work schedule and asked if she could give me more details about his hours. "Actually, Mr. Thompson," Maria said, "I need to be honest with you about something. Carlos doesn't really work late that often, maybe once or twice a week at most. But you said he was at the office until 8 or 9 p.m. almost every night." "No, I think you misunderstood me. I said he tells people he's working late almost every night, but his car is usually gone from the parking garage by 6 p.m. Maria's clarification made everything clear. Carlos had been lying to both his co-workers and his family about his schedule. He told Sarah he was working late, but he told his colleagues that he left early to spend time with his family. "Maria, can I ask you something else? Do you know if Carlos has been seeing anyone outside of his marriage?" There was a long pause. "Mr. Thompson, I probably shouldn't say anything, but since you're Sarah's father, yes, I think Carlos has been having an affair. I've seen him with a woman who doesn't work at our company. They seem very close." "How long has this been going?" "On? At least 2 years, maybe longer. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, I always liked Sarah when I met her. She seems like a wonderful person." 2 years. Carlos had been cheating on my daughter for at least 2 years, while convincing her that her mental health problems were caused by my presence in her life. The next day, I hired a private investigator named Detective Brown, who specialized in marital infidelity cases. I explained the situation and asked him to document Carlos's affair so that Sarah would have evidence if she decided to divorce him. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Brown said, "what you're describing sounds like a classic pattern of emotional abuse. The cheating spouse creates a scapegoat to explain their partner's distress, which serves 2 purposes. It deflects suspicion from their own behavior, and it isolates their partner from potential support systems." How common is this? More common than you'd think. Cheating spouses often manipulate family relationships to maintain their affairs. By convincing Sarah that your presence was causing her problems, Carlos ensured that you wouldn't be around to notice his suspicious behavior or provide emotional support that might help Sarah recognize the real source of her unhappiness. Detective Brown's investigation over the next 2 weeks revealed the full scope of Carlos's deception. Carlos had been having an affair with a woman named Jessica Chen, no relation to the Carlos and Linda from my earlier story, who worked as a marketing consultant for various companies. They had been seeing each other for almost 3 years, dating back to when Emma was 3 years old and Sarah was supposedly struggling with postpartum depression. The affair wasn't casual. Carlos and Jessica were in a serious relationship. They vacationed together when Carlos told Sarah he was attending work conferences. They had joint credit cards that Carlos hid from Sarah. Jessica even had a key to a luxury apartment that Carlos rented under his name, but never told Sarah about. Carlos was essentially living a double life. He had his official life with Sarah and Emma, and his secret life with Jessica. He funded his affair by taking money from the family budget and using credit cards that he kept hidden from Sarah. This explained why Sarah's house looked so run down, despite Carlos's claims of working overtime for extra money. He wasn't earning more money. He was spending their existing money on his mistress. But the most damaging evidence Detective Brown uncovered was a series of text messages between Carlos and Jessica, where they discussed how to handle the Sarah problem. In these messages, Carlos described Sarah as emotionally unstable and overly dependent on her father. He told Jessica that he was managing Sarah's mental health issues by limiting her contact with family members who fed into her depression. Carlos had turned my relationship with my daughter into a mental health issue that he was heroically managing, all while conducting an affair that was the real source of Sarah's emotional distress. If you think you're angry now, wait until you hear what Carlos said when I finally confronted him with the evidence. His response showed me just how manipulative and dangerous this man really was. I decided to confront Carlos on a Thursday evening when I knew he would be meeting Jessica at their usual restaurant. I wanted him to know that his secret was exposed before he had a chance to prepare lies or excuses. I arrived at Romano's at 7 p.m. and found Carlos and Jessica at the same corner table where I had first seen them together. I walked directly to their table and sat down in the empty chair without being invited. "Hello, Carlos," I said calmly. "I think we need to talk." Carlos's face went white. Jessica looked confused and alarmed. "Hank," Carlos stammered, "what are you doing here?" "I'm here because I know about your affair. I know you've been lying to Sarah about working late. I know you've been spending family money on your girlfriend. And I know you've been using me as a scapegoat to explain Sarah's depression while you destroy her mental health with your cheating." Jessica started to stand up, but I held up my hand. "Please don't leave, Jessica. You should hear this too, since you're part of the situation." Carlos tried to regain his composure. "Hank, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Jessica is a work colleague. We were discussing a project." "Carlos, I've been watching you for 2 weeks. I have photographs of you kissing her, entering an apartment together, and spending entire evenings at hotels. I also have copies of your text messages where you discuss how to manage the Sarah problem while you continue your affair." The blood drained from Carlos's face as he realized how much evidence I had gathered. "Additionally," I continued, "I know that you've been lying about your work schedule to both your family and your colleagues. I know that you've been stealing money from your household budget to fund this relationship. And I know that you've spent 3 years convincing my daughter that her depression was caused by my interference in your marriage." Jessica finally spoke up. "Carlos, is this true? Are you married?" "Jessica, I can explain." "You told me you were divorced," Jessica said, her voice rising. "You told me your ex-wife was mentally unstable and that you were waiting for the custody situation to be resolved before we could go public with our relationship." I looked at Jessica with sympathy. "Ms. Chen, Carlos isn't divorced. He's very much married to my daughter Sarah, and they have a 6-year-old daughter named Emma. Carlos has been lying to both of you." Jessica stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Carlos started to follow her, but I grabbed his arm. "Sit down, Carlos, we're not finished." Carlos reluctantly sat back down, looking like a trapped animal. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to go home tonight and tell Sarah the truth about everything. You're going to admit that you've been having an affair, that you've been lying about working late, and that you've been manipulating our family relationships to cover your cheating." "Hank, please, I'm not finished. You're also going to admit that you lied about Sarah's mental health, that you used me as a scapegoat to explain her depression, and that you deliberately tried to isolate her from her support system so she wouldn't discover your affair." Carlos was sweating now and his hands were shaking. "If you don't tell Sarah the truth tonight, I will tell her tomorrow morning, and I'll provide her with all the evidence I've gathered, including the photographs, the text messages, and the financial records showing how you've been stealing from your family to fund your affair." "What do you want from me?" "I want you to stop lying to my daughter. I want you to stop blaming other people for the problems you've created. And I want you to give Sarah the information she needs to make an informed decision about her marriage." Carlos tried one last manipulation tactic. "Hank, if you destroy my marriage, you'll destroy Emma's family. Is that really what you want for your granddaughter?" The audacity of this statement took my breath away. Carlos was trying to use Emma as a shield to protect himself from the consequences of his own actions. "Carlos, you destroyed Emma's family when you decided to cheat on her mother. You destroyed Sarah's mental health when you chose to blame me for problems you created. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just refusing to let you continue destroying my family with your lies." I stood up and looked down at this man who had caused so much pain to people I loved. "You have until tomorrow morning to tell Sarah the truth. If you don't, I will. And Carlos, when Sarah finds out what you've done, don't you dare try to blame me for the consequences of your own choices." As I walked out of that restaurant, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of finally standing up for my daughter. But the real confrontation was still to come. Because when Carlos went home that night, instead of confessing to Sarah, He decided to try one final manipulation that would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. That night, instead of going home to confess to Sarah as I had demanded, Carlos decided to try one final manipulation that would prove just how desperate and calculating he really was. At 11:30 p.m., my phone rang. It was Sarah, and she was crying hysterically. "Dad, you need to come over right now," she sobbed. "Carlos told me something terrible, and I don't know what to believe." When I arrived at their house 20 minutes later, I found Sarah pacing in the living room while Carlos sat on the couch with his head in his hands, playing the role of the devastated victim. "Dad," Sarah said through her tears, "Carlos says you've been following him and making threats. He says you've been trying to break up our marriage because you never approved of him." I looked at Carlos with disgust. Even when caught red-handed, he was still trying to manipulate the situation by making me the villain. Have you ever watched someone you despise try to turn your own child against you with lies? Have you ever had to prove your innocence to someone you love while the real criminal sits there pretending to be the victim? "Sarah," I said calmly, "what exactly did Carlos tell you?" "He said you've been stalking him, taking pictures of him with work colleagues, and threatening to ruin his career if he doesn't leave me. He said you've been trying to destroy our marriage for years because you want me to move back home and take care of you." Carlos had taken every element of the truth and twisted it into a story where he was the innocent victim of a possessive, manipulative father-in-law. It was a masterful piece of gaslighting, designed to make Sarah doubt her own father instead of questioning her husband's behavior. "Carlos," I said, looking directly at him, "is that really the story you want to tell Sarah? Because I have evidence that will prove every word you just said is a lie." Carlos's face went pale, but he tried to maintain his act. "Hank, I know you're upset that Sarah chose to build a life with me instead of staying home to take care of you after Betty died, but this harassment has to stop." The audacity was breathtaking. Carlos was using my wife's death and my grief as weapons against me, while sitting in his living room as a cheating husband who had been stealing from his family for years. "Sarah," I said, pulling out my phone, "I'm going to show you some photographs. I want you to look at them carefully and then decide who's telling the truth." I showed Sarah the photos Detective Brown had taken of Carlos and Jessica kissing outside Romano's restaurant, entering the luxury apartment together, and sharing intimate moments at various hotels throughout the city. Sarah stared at the photos, in silence, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, devastating comprehension. "Carlos," she whispered. "Who is this woman?" Carlos tried one more desperate lie. "Sarah, these photos are fake. Your father hired someone to create fake evidence because he's obsessed with breaking us up. But I had more than just photos. Sarah, these are text messages between Carlos and Jessica Chen, the woman in the photographs. In these messages, they discuss their 3-year relationship, their vacations together, and their plans for the future. I showed Sarah the text thread where Carlos described her as emotionally unstable and discussed how he was managing her mental health by limiting her contact with family members. "And here," I continued, "are the financial records showing the money Carlos has been taking from your household budget to pay for apartments, restaurants, and gifts for his mistress." As Sarah read through the evidence, Carlos made one final attempt to control the narrative. "Sarah, your father is having a mental breakdown. He's been obsessed with me since Betty died because he blames me for taking you away from him. He's created this elaborate fantasy because he can't accept that you chose to prioritize your marriage over taking care of him." But Sarah had seen enough evidence to recognize the truth. "Put yourself in my daughter's position. Everything you believed about your marriage, your mental health, and your family relationships has just been revealed as a lie. How would you react?" Sarah turned to Carlos with a look of pure fury that I had never seen on her face before. 3 years, she said, her voice shaking with rage. "For 3 years, you told me that my depression was caused by my father's interference in our marriage. You convinced me that I was mentally unstable, that I needed therapy, that I was imagining problems that didn't exist. Sarah, please. You made me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with my father. You made me believe that including him in our lives was hurting our marriage. You isolated me from the only family I have left while you were sleeping with another woman. Carlos tried to interrupt, but Sarah wasn't finished. You told me I was depressed because of unresolved grief about losing my mother. You said seeing my father reminded me of that loss, and that's why I felt sad after his visits. But I wasn't sad because of grief, Carlos. I was sad because you were lying to me every single day. Sarah picked up one of the photos showing Carlos and Jessica in an intimate embrace. This woman knows more about your real life than I do. You've been living a double life for 3 years while making me think I was losing my mind. Sarah, I can explain everything. Explain what? Explain how you've been stealing money from our family to pay for hotel rooms with your girlfriend. Explain how you convinced my father to stay away from our house so he wouldn't accidentally discover your affair. Explain how you used my mental health as a cover story for your cheating. Carlos realized that his manipulation tactics were no longer working. Sarah had seen too much evidence to be gaslit into believing his lies. Fine, Carlos said, his mask finally dropping completely. Yes, I've been seeing Jessica. But Sarah, you drove me to it. You were depressed, you were needy, you were always complaining about something. Jessica understands me in ways you never could. The room went completely silent. Carlos had just admitted to his affair and blamed Sarah for causing it. I drove you to it? Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. I was depressed because my husband was cheating on me and gaslighting me into thinking I was mentally ill. I was needy because you were never home, and I was raising our daughter alone while you lived a secret life with another woman. Sarah, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. No, Carlos, you don't understand the pressure you put me under. You made me doubt my own sanity. You made me feel guilty for wanting my father's support. You made me believe that I was the problem in our marriage while you were the one destroying it. Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes. Dad, I'm so sorry. I believed his lies about you interfering in our marriage. I let him convince me that your love and support were somehow harmful to my mental health. I pushed you away when I needed you most. Sarah, you don't need to apologize for anything. Carlos manipulated both of us. He used our love for each other as a weapon against us. Carlos made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Sarah, we can work through this. We can go to counseling. I'll end things with Jessica. We can start over. Sarah looked at Carlos with an expression of complete disgust. Work through this? Carlos, you didn't just cheat on me. You systematically destroyed my relationship with my father to cover up your affair. You convinced me that I was mentally unstable to explain my unhappiness. You stole money from our family to fund your relationship with another woman. You used our daughter as an excuse to keep me trapped in this marriage while you lived whatever life you wanted. People make mistakes, Sarah. Marriage is about forgiveness. Mistakes? Carlos, you planned this. You orchestrated a 3-year campaign to isolate me from my support system while you carried on an affair. You turned my father into a scapegoat for problems you created. This wasn't a mistake, this was psychological abuse. At that moment, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, awakened by the raised voices. "Mommy, why are you crying?" she asked in a small voice. Sarah immediately composed herself and went to comfort her daughter. "Everything's okay, sweetheart. Mommy and Daddy are just having an adult conversation. Go back to bed and I'll come tuck you in again in a few minutes." After Sarah took Emma back to her room, Carlos turned to me with desperation. "Hank, you got what you wanted. You destroyed my marriage. Are you happy now?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about Carlos's character. Even after being caught in a 3-year affair, even after being exposed as a manipulative liar, he still couldn't take responsibility for his own actions. "I didn't destroy your marriage, Carlos. You destroyed it when you decided to cheat on my daughter. You destroyed it when you decided to use me as a scapegoat for your betrayal. You destroyed it when you chose to emotionally abuse Sarah instead of being honest about your feelings. What happens to Emma? Did you think about what this would do to her?" Carlos, Emma deserves better than growing up in a home built on lies and manipulation. She deserves a father who respects her mother and treats family relationships with honesty and integrity. When Sarah returned from tucking Emma back into bed, she had clearly made some decisions. "Carlos, I want you to pack a bag and leave tonight. You can stay at your apartment, the one you've been hiding from me for 3 years. Sarah, please. I need time to think about everything. and I can't do that with you here trying to manipulate the situation. Emma and I need space to process what we've learned. What about counseling? What about working on our marriage? Sarah looked at Carlos with an expression that was part pity and part revulsion. Carlos, there's no marriage to work on. There's just a lie you've been maintaining for 3 years, while you lived your real life with someone else. I can't rebuild a relationship with someone who used my mental health as a cover story for their infidelity. Carlos gathered some clothes and personal items while Sarah and I waited in the living room. When he reached the front door, he turned back for one final manipulation attempt. Sarah, when you've had time to think about this rationally, you'll realize that your father has poisoned your mind against me. Don't let his jealousy destroy what we've built together. Sarah's response was calm and final. What we built together was a lie, Carlos. The only honest thing in this house tonight was my father's love for his family, something you've apparently never understood. After Carlos left, Sarah and I sat in her living room and talked until sunrise. She told me how lonely and confused she had been for the past 3 years, how she had questioned her own mental health and how much she had missed our relationship. Dad, I feel so stupid for believing his lies about you. Sarah, Carlos is a master manipulator. He used our love for each other against us. That's not your fault, that's his cruelty. How did you know to investigate him? I told Sarah about my conversation with Maria Rodriguez and how her comments about Carlos's work schedule had revealed the first crack in his story. Once I realized he was lying about working late, I knew I had to find out what he was really doing. I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer while believing that I was somehow causing your problems, Sarah cried when she realized how much damage Carlos's lies had done to our relationship. I missed you so much, Dad. I thought you were disappointed in me as a mother, or that you didn't approve of my marriage. I never understood why you suddenly became distant. I was trying to give you space because Carlos convinced me that my presence was stressing you out. I thought I was helping by staying away. You were never the problem, Dad. Carlos was the problem, and he used you as a scapegoat to hide his own failures as a husband. Over the next few weeks, Sarah filed for divorce and began the process of rebuilding her life as a single mother. The financial investigation revealed that Carlos had stolen over $40,000 from their joint accounts to fund his affair. Sarah's lawyer was able to recover most of the money and secure full custody of Emma, with Carlos getting limited visitation rights. The most satisfying part of the aftermath was watching Carlos's life fall apart as the consequences of his actions finally caught up with him. Jessica Chen, his mistress, had dumped him immediately after learning that he was married and had been lying to her for 3 years. She also discovered that Carlos had been using joint credit cards to pay for their relationship, which technically made her an unwilling participant in theft from his family. Carlos's employer launched an investigation after learning that he had been falsifying his work schedule and using company resources for personal activities. He was fired for dishonesty and breach of company policy. Without his job and without Sarah's financial support, Carlos couldn't afford the luxury apartment he had been renting for his affair. He had to move back in with his parents at age 37, explaining to them why his marriage had ended and why he was unemployed. But the most important change was in Sarah's mental health. Once she understood that her depression had been caused by her husband's lies and emotional abuse rather than by any character flaws in herself, Sarah's confidence and happiness returned remarkably quickly. I feel like myself again for the first time in 3 years, she told me during one of our regular weekly dinners. I'm not constantly questioning my own perceptions or wondering if I'm being too sensitive about things. How's Emma adjusting? She's actually doing better than I expected. She was confused at first about why Daddy moved out, but she's been much happier since the tension in the house disappeared. Children pick up on emotional stress even when adults try to hide it. Sarah started therapy to work through the trauma of being emotionally abused and gaslit for 3 years. Her therapist confirmed that Carlos's behavior fit classic patterns of psychological manipulation designed to isolate victims from their support systems. The therapist says that turning family members against each other is a common tactic among abusive partners, Sarah explained. They create conflict between their victim and potential sources of support so that the victim becomes more dependent on the abuser. That explains why Carlos was so insistent that I was causing your problems. He needed me to believe that my unhappiness was coming from external sources rather than from his behavior. If I had maintained a close relationship with you, you might have helped me recognize the signs of his emotional abuse. 6 months after Carlos moved out, Sarah and Emma moved into a smaller house closer to where I live. We now have dinner together twice a week, and I pick up Emma from school every Tuesday and Thursday. Grandpa Hank, Emma said during one of our afternoons together, I like it better when you come see us all the time instead of just sometimes. I like it better too, sweetheart. I missed you and your mummy very much when I couldn't visit as often. Why couldn't you visit before? It was a difficult question to answer honestly, without speaking negatively about her father. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about what's best for families, I said carefully. But now we know that families are happiest when they spend time together and take care of each other. Today, almost a year after exposing Carlos's affair, Sarah is thriving as a single mother. She's been promoted at work, Emma is excelling in school, and our family relationship is stronger than it's ever been. Carlos occasionally tries to contact Sarah with apologies and requests for reconciliation, but she has learned to recognize his manipulation tactics and no longer responds to them. I realize that Carlos never actually apologized for what he did, Sarah told me recently. He only apologized for getting caught. Every conversation with him was about how I should forgive him, not about the damage he caused or the changes he needed to make. Have you heard anything about how he's doing? Maria told me he's been trying to date other women, but word has gotten around about what happened to our marriage. Apparently, most women aren't interested in dating a man who cheated on his wife for 3 years and then blamed his father-in-law for the divorce. If this story taught me anything, it's that manipulative people will use your love against you if you let them. Carlos weaponized my love for Sarah and her love for me to create conflict that served his purposes. He also taught me that isolation is a key tool of emotional abusers. By convincing Sarah that my presence was harmful to her mental health, Carlos removed the one person who might have recognized his manipulation and helped Sarah see the truth. But most importantly, this experience showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable the people who are hurting them. I could have continued to stay away from Sarah's life to avoid causing problems in her marriage, but that would have left her isolated and vulnerable to Carlos's continued abuse. By investigating Carlos's lies and exposing his affair, I didn't destroy Sarah's marriage. I revealed that the marriage had already been destroyed by Carlos's betrayal and manipulation. Today, Sarah is building a new life based on honesty, self-respect, and genuine family relationships. Emma is growing up in a home where truth is valued over convenience and where family members support each other instead of being turned against each other. And I have my daughter back, not as the broken, depressed woman that Carlos's abuse had created, but as the strong, confident, loving person she had always been underneath. Carlos Martinez thought he could use me as a scapegoat for his failures as a husband. He thought he could manipulate family relationships to cover his infidelity and emotional abuse, but he underestimated one crucial thing. A father's love for his daughter doesn't disappear just because someone tries to weaponize it. And when that love is combined with determination to protect family from predators who disguise themselves as caregivers, it becomes a force that liars and manipulators cannot overcome. Carlos lost everything: his wife, his daughter, his home, his job, and his reputation, because he thought he could build happiness on a foundation of lies and emotional abuse. But Sarah and Emma and I gained something more valuable than anything Carlos lost. We gained each other back, and we gained the knowledge that our family bonds are stronger than any manipulation tactics designed to break them.